Today we'll be talking about a man that would potentially become the most powerful man in European, if not world history. He is Charles V, and he would eventually head what Voltaire once called the not so holy nor Roman nor an empire, Holy Roman Empire. His name and his family comes up so often in my videos that I decided to make something unusual. Part 1 and Part 2, just for him, Charles V of Habsburg, because his life is littered with great facts. Oh, and while you're here, please consider liking, commenting and subscribing. To understand his relevance, we need to talk about what he headed, the Holy Roman Empire, which Voltaire, as I just said, was not holy nor Roman nor an empire, because it was actually a loosely connected confederation of states. He couldn't raise taxes, he couldn't raise armies from this, so there was no loyalty to the emperor. But still, it lasted for over 1,000 years, and Charles V was the head of this empire at its very zenith of influence. Now, to understand this influence, let's say Germany and Argentina are having a football match against each other, and let's say that this football match happened in the 1550s. Well, they would have had the same head of state, Charles V. The same can be said for Spain and the Netherlands, Burgundian France versus Italy, Austria versus Mexico, Peru versus Venezuela, Tunisia against Slovakia. This man literally ruled half the world. The Holy Roman Empire is one of the biggest empires in history. Behind Genghis Khan and the USSR, if we can even call it an empire, his one kingdom, Spain, at one point owned the entire New World apart from Brazil, while under his leadership Magellan and his party circumnavigated the entire globe, even though Magellan died halfway around. He gave the conquistadors a seal of approval. He sent Christian missions to convert the Philippines. He tried unsuccessfully to abolish slavery. He even held the first councils for the first human rights movements, and he was pretty much the ruler of Europe. This guy, Charles V, is an important person. Amazingly, for all he did, if I say Charles V to someone, they'd be like, who? Well, his reign can be seen as a failure. Even the man himself said he was a failure. He led his empire into bankruptcy, even though he had the might of the Medici Bank behind him, the Spanish Navy, and the gold and silver mines in the New World. He had the likes of Martin Luther to deal with. He had the likes of stressing over running an empire that spanned 2 hemispheres, which would eventually kill him from gout and malaria at the age of 58 after abdicating his thrones. He was born on the 24th of February 1500 in Ghent, in Belgium, which was then known as Flanders, to the Archduke of Austria, Philip I, who would eventually become the King of Castile, which was the largest kingdom in Spain. Spain was not yet a country. And Joanna I, who would eventually become Queen of Aragon in her own right, but she was the third daughter of the King of Aragon. So this was the second largest kingdom in Spain. He was incredibly entitled from birth. His parents were literally as royal as they came. They had lands and fiefs everywhere. Naturally, the marriage was a political one back then, which saw Austrian Habsburg rule unify with the Spanish rule so that they could flank their common enemy because of the mess that they had made in Italy, France. He was born into a life of opulence and wealth. From his birth, he was given the title Prince and Duke of Luxembourg. His baptism saw the very peak of Renaissance European royalty congregate as his parents, both sovereigns to be, in their own right, finally had an heir to unify their kingdoms. His parents, however, left him in the custody of his godmother, Margaret of York, who was the sister of Edward III of England. Charles wouldn't see his parents until he was 3 years old in 1503, and apparently his father rarely enjoyed spending time with him, saying that they had lots of fun. His mother, on the other hand, was cold to him. His mother, unfortunately, was mentally unstable, which drew his parents away from each other in what was already an unhappy marriage. Charles unfortunately had learning disabilities. He struggled to learn how to read and to write, and in general, he could struggle to communicate because he had a overly large bottom jaw due to the inbreeding from his family. So unfortunately, this led him to be quite a loner and an outsider. Even though he was completely respected and very entitled, he had quite a sad beginning to his life. This already not so nice childhood was only made worse when his father died in 1506, which sent his mother, and I quote, into complete insanity, which led the powers that be lock her up in a tower in France. Our young prince was forced out of the classroom and into the spotlight at age 6. Now, even though this is Renaissance Europe, they weren't completely stupid. They knew that a 6-year-old couldn't become king and couldn't rule. So his grandfather, on his mother's side, Ferdinand II of Aragon, decided he'd take rulership over the Spanish lands until young Charles would come of age. Nevertheless, he was allowed to re-enter the classroom, which is actually a really good thing because he started to shine and he became called both smart and sensible, even though he had these learning disabilities. Eventually, he was able to speak 4 languages, where he would state in his prime, when he was an old man, I can speak Spanish to God, Italian to women, French to men, and German to my horse. Spanish to God because he felt it was the holy language. Italian because he felt that Italians loved so well. French because it was the most common language in Europe at the time, literally the lingua franca. And German because horses can be seen as a weapon of war. So he felt that the entire German state should be used as a weapon of war. Seeing that his father died at such a young age and his mother was locked away in a tower due to insanity, his grandfather, aunts, uncles, and godmothers all decided to take care of him. The Habsburgs were married in everywhere. If there was a throne, there was a Habsburg somewhere near it. And his grandfather, on his father's side, his paternal grandfather, Maximilian I, who was already the Holy Roman Emperor at that time, betrothed young Charles, age 7, to Mary, the daughter of Henry VII of England, who was aged 11. Now, this marriage wasn't unnatural at that time. It was quite normal for European royalty to be betrothed at such a young age. Fortunately or unfortunately, this marriage wouldn't go ahead because Mary would eventually marry Louis XII of France in 1514. Growing up, he spent most of his teenage years learning with his sisters at the court of his aunt, who was the Duchess of Savoy. Adrian of Ulrich, who had become Pope Adrian VI, was his tutor. He taught him. Of course, our young Charles was knighted into the Order of the Golden Fleece as a baby, which is potentially still the most famous and elite dynastic honors in the entire world. Here he would become used to ideas of medieval chivalry and how important it is to reunify Christendom in order to fight, and I quote, the infidels. In other words, he was taught how to become a good prince in the Renaissance and medieval Christendom. When Charles's father died in 1506, one of the titles he inherited was Lord of the Habsburg Netherlands, which is known as the Burgundian Low Countries because they were close down to the sea and there were no real mountains, and it included modern-day Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. This area was so rich in culture and material wealth. Our young Charles enjoyed spending time there. He liked being in Brussels because he was pretty much the king and could do what he liked. By 1516, his grandfather Ferdinand, who had been ruling in the Spanish lands for him, died, which meant that at age 16, he would become a reigning monarch, the king of a semi-unified Spain and all of her realms, which included kingdoms of Naples, Sicily, and Sardinia, as well as the islands of the West Indies. Oh, and one catch. He had to rule these kingdoms with his mother, but he would go visit his mother from time to time, who was still locked in this gilded cage, and he felt that she wasn't ready to be released from it. It truly is a very sad, sad story. Coming to Spain to rule his new kingdoms from the Low Countries, the Spanish weren't very happy with their new king. They felt he couldn't really communicate with them too well. He shared only a few cultural similarities to them. He was met with resistance, which would see persons being poisoned, jostling for position, and the whole situation was just uncomfortable and unwelcoming. He was, however, allowed to stay as long as he played the Spanish Game of Thrones, because each throne in Spain was ruled completely differently. Charles now became Carlos II of Spain, but he would eventually have to reconquer parts of his own kingdom because it was so unruly, even hundreds of years afterwards. King Victor Emmanuel II of Italy helped his brother Amadeo be elected King of Italy in 1870, would be forced to return after a number of assassination attempts, even though they elected him as the king, and he would state that the Spanish people were ungovernable. To keep peace in his land, he had to bend to the will of the Spanish court, ensuring that they would become fabulously wealthy by doing one thing he would eventually pray he did not. When he was 19 years old on the 28th of August 1518, he authorized that Spanish vessels could be used to transport slaves from Africa to America. Please join me for part 2, which would see Carlos II, King of Spain, become Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, Archduke of Austria, King of Germany, King of Italy, and the last Roman king to be crowned by the Pope. Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed it. Like, comment, subscribe, the more you know.